Tyler, it's been a pretty brutal week if you own shares of New Holdings or Mercado Libre or Stone Co. Let's talk about what's going on.
I have to assume that when we're talking about Brazilian companies and foreign currencies, I'm probably what, like second or third on your list of people you would call?
You're number one if we're talking about the foreign currency part, which is definitely part of this story. As somebody that's lived in a lot of countries and understands the economics of how this affects businesses, let's unpack what's going on, talk about the risk to investors, how they should be thinking about it, the implications, talk a little bit about long term, what I think about these businesses. I'm Jason Hall. This is Investing Unscripted. This video is sponsored by The Motley Fool. If you're looking for even more great stock ideas, you should go to our special link. It's fool.com/unscripted. Go check out that link and you can get access to the Motley Fool's top 10 best stocks to buy right now. So, Tyler, we'll start right here. This is the price of the stocks of these two businesses. Really, we can go back. This has been unfolding for a while. It's come to a head a little bit more recently. But if we look over the past month, these stocks, since they really started falling around late November, Mercado Libre stocks down over 20% and almost 28% decline for New Holdings. Those two companies, to be specific, New Holdings is a bank and a fintech company that's based in Brazil. They operate in Brazil. And Mercado Libre, Brazil is one of their biggest markets in Latin America.
This is where it gets a little bit weird because when you talk about foreign listed companies, a lot of the time when it comes to big companies, we often think about like stuff priced in dollars. Like I follow the energy industry a lot, right? And even though they're international companies, they get all their revenue in dollars. So that's where this situation gets a little bit different because when you talk about Brazilian companies that cater, or broadly Latin American companies that cater to customers in or people in those areas, you're going to run into being paid in the local currency. And that's where you start to get things like foreign currency risk.
Yeah, no, that's right. And for of these two businesses, New Holdings, obviously with their new bank subsidiary, currency exchange is only part of the picture here. We're talking about a bank, right? When you're going through serious currency devaluation, there's a lot of things about the economics of your business that are being impacted, particularly for a bank. If you're lending to borrowers and the currency is being devalued, they're having to take more of that currency to pay for other things. So it creates a certain amount of credit risk of your borrowers. Maybe the number that's coming in is the same, but the spending power of that number has completely changed.
Yeah, I want to give a quick analogy. I think for most people, and to give it a sense of how this all kind of works. Imagine being in an airport, right, where you're going up to the airport and you're going down like one of the terminals, and you've got those walkways where one's going in one direction and one's in the other. If you are running into this situation where, in this case, the Brazilian real is declining relative to the U.S. dollar, it's like you're walking on that the assisted walkway in the opposite direction. You have to walk faster to actually even stand still or move forward. Because in this case, what's end up happening is with the devaluation of the real for you, the investor, what that means is, say, for example, Mercado Libre grows its earnings by 5% in local currency standards. If the value of the currency drops by 5%, you, the investor who gets your money in dollars, basically it's flat. Nothing's happened. So you've had to run to just stay in place. Conversely, if a currency strengthens against the US dollar and you're invested in that company, it's like being on that other side of that walkway terminal where you don't have to walk as hard and you're going even faster. I could use that exact same analogy for a lot of things like stock issuance or stock buybacks, kind of the same idea, but basically sometimes there's these factors like this where it's working for you or against you as the individual shareholder. And in this case, over the past month, the Brazilian real has lost 5% of its value relative to the US dollar. I don't think anybody really wants to get too much into the nitty-gritty on why that's the case, but a little bit of a overspending at the Brazilian government's made people a little bit nervous about lending more there, which probably means devaluation of the currency. So when you have a situation like this, the earnings power, I guess you will, in US dollars for a Mercado Libre or a New Holdings, new bank, starts to deteriorate for you, the investor. Now, I guess the good news is, and for somebody who's followed currency markets, foreign listed companies, things like that, typically over very long hold periods, say if you want to buy a stock for 10, 15, 20 years, often foreign currency fluctuation comes out in the wash over very, very long periods. It has more or less not been that big of a factor. It can in over the short term be a major factor. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of this. Now, I will confess, before we did this, I didn't get too deep into looking into what kind of debt Mercado Libre has or what kind of the loan book or the debt book for New Bank Holdings. But an additional factor that you have to, Jason, you were talking about lending out in reals, and when you get that money back, it's going to be worth less. There's also the possibility that sometimes these banks will take out loans in foreign currencies, and that can be an added problem too, because if you are having to pay back in dollars, but you're getting your money in reals, it can be
It costs
pretty
more.
problematic. Yeah,
Right.
I do. To give one example of this, Petrobras during the 2010s. Petrobras is the Brazilian oil company, their national oil company. They had billions of dollars in US denominated debt, but they were getting payment for retail gasoline in Brazil in reals, and it was making it much more challenging for them to pay back their debt. Now, again, I don't want to speak specifically to these loan
Yeah.
books, but if you are an investor, you may want to go take a look like, hey, how much of their debt or is denominated in dollars? Because that could be an issue when you have a currency devaluation.
Over the long term, you're spot on. It does tend to wash out, but in the near term, it affects the ins and outs of your money. And I've added StoneCo to this as well. That's another Brazilian fintech that's dealing with some of the same things. So thinking about the material risk of these businesses, I want to start there and talk about how it affects them. Number one, for StoneCo to some extent, New Holdings to a larger extent, and also Mercado Libre, they have finance businesses as well. And the same is directly for those businesses. If they borrow in US dollars, but all their money that's coming in is coming in at reais, which is actually how you pronounce reals in Portuguese. So
Sorry, I'm not. My
I looked it
Portuguese
up
is
one
awful.
time 3 years ago. That's all. That's the only reason I know.
You
So
just did that to rub it in my face. Good
a
job.
little, a little. But the point is that it now costs you more of that money that you're generating to service that debt, right? Because the inflation, your currency's lost value against that other currency. But again, I want to circle back around to what I talked about before is how it affects your borrowers. They're having to spend more money to buy milk and bread and eggs, fuel. Like inflation is affecting their discretionary spending, and that increases your credit risk from your borrowers, increases the risk of defaults, right? Which further increases the risk on your cash flows to pay your liabilities, right? And your liabilities aren't just paying debt. If you're Mercado Libre, it's buying inventory, right? All of those things get affected. Your ability to cover your operating costs and pay your employees and your vendors and your contractors, like all of those things get squeezed when your customers, whether they're borrowers or buyers, their discretionary income gets squeezed because of inflation. So I think that's a material risk to think about. And I wanted to talk about that specifically in the case of Mercado Libre. Something you and I've talked about is that as Mercado Libre has expanded, they've grown their fintech business. Mercado Pago is hugely important as a payment system. They've also started to lend, and they have a pretty big lending book now as well. And Brazil, being one of the largest economies in Latin America, that's a large part of their lending book. And so they have some risk there as well to credit defaults that investors should be thinking about. So all of that said, I will say this, of this group of companies, here's my final take on it. Mercado Libre is the one that I think is the least risky, particularly in the near term. It is incredibly financially strong. The risk, the currency volatility risk I don't think it necessarily creates a big risk for Mercado Libre because they tend to keep their currencies local because they're still growing in all of their markets. So they're reinvesting that capital in those local markets. They're not moving it from one market to the next necessarily. So I don't think it creates a substantial amount of risk for Mercado Libre. It probably will make their books look a little uglier, right? While this is playing out over the quarters that this is going on. But I think long term, this could be creating an opportunity for investors to buy because that's a stock that's really, really run up over the past couple of years. So it could be creating an opportunity to buy. I think with New Holdings and StoneCo, investors need to watch list those companies and start learning what is the material risk of their customers being affected, particularly for StoneCo with the way they operate their business, their fintech services. And for New Holdings, for Newbank, what is the credit risk that's being created by very high inflation affecting their customers' ability to service the loans, to pay the loans that they have, because credit risk is probably the biggest for Newbank of these companies right now.